June 1944. A muddy French road stretches beyond the horizon, swallowed by a crawling line of olive-green machines. The air smells of diesel, rubber, and wet soil. Engines rumble in rhythm, not of a few tanks, but of hundreds. The sound never stops. From a ridge overlooking the valley, a group of captured German officers watch in silence. Their field glasses tremble slightly as another column of M4 Shermans rolls forward, followed by trucks piled high with fuel drums, ammunition crates, and spare parts. Every few minutes, a new convoy appears, as if the earth itself is producing them. One officer lowers his binoculars, muttering that these Americans must have endless factories hidden somewhere. Another keeps counting, loses track, and finally stops. In their notebooks, they had once estimated Allied armor losses and expected a pause in movement. But what they're seeing now defies logic. Tanks arriving faster than they can be destroyed. They don't yet know it, but they're witnessing the true secret of America's war: the machine behind the machine. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, the United States was still a neutral power. Its army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than that of Portugal. Few could imagine that within 4 years, America would not only field the most mobile and mechanized force in history, but would also deliver those forces across an ocean with clockwork precision. The transformation began in 1940, long before American troops landed in Europe. As the clouds of war spread over Europe and Asia, President Franklin D. Roosevelt pushed a quiet revolution in industry. Automobile plants in Detroit retooled to build tanks, aircraft engines, and armored hulls. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, became the beating heart of this new industrial war machine. By 1942, assembly lines that once produced sedans were turning out M4 Sherman tanks every hour. Each Sherman was not the strongest or the heaviest tank on the battlefield. The German Panther and Tiger could outgun it easily. But the Sherman had something far more decisive behind it. A system that guaranteed it would always arrive, always move, and always return to battle. The design was simple, modular, and standardized. Engines, suspensions, and transmissions could be swapped in the field. Mechanics could cannibalize damaged Shermans and have another rolling within hours. American engineers had built a tank not to dominate one duel, but to win a campaign through endurance. Behind this design stood an industrial structure unlike anything the world had seen. The United States built more than 50,000 Shermans between 1942 and 1945. That meant, on average, 1,000 tanks a month, a number so vast that even German intelligence analysts refused to believe it at first. But it wasn't just factories. The real miracle was movement. Every tank had to be shipped, fueled, repaired, and resupplied thousands of miles from the assembly line. To achieve this, the U.S. Army created a logistical network that fused military discipline with industrial engineering. From the docks of New York to the beaches of Normandy, each crate, bolt, and gallon of gasoline followed a pre-planned route. When the first Shermans landed in North Africa in 1942, they rolled out of ships fully fueled and combat-ready. The same system matured during the Italian campaign and would reach its peak 2 years later in France. By the time Allied forces prepared for the Normandy invasion, the American military had become a mobile factory complex that moved with its own arteries of fuel and steel. This was not a single army. It was an industrial civilization on the move. For German officers, this idea was unthinkable. Their own logistics were bound by railways, rationed fuel, and desperate improvisation. They could not yet see how the war was shifting from one of tactics to one of production and supply. As the American buildup across the Atlantic gathered momentum, even seasoned German commanders began to ask a quiet question. How could a nation produce, ship, and maintain so much so fast? They would soon get their answer. On the battlefields of Normandy, where every destroyed Sherman seemed to be replaced by 2 more. In the summer of 1944, when the Allies finally broke through the beaches of Normandy, German intelligence began a desperate effort to understand the machinery behind the invasion. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed the ports of Cherbourg and Omaha. Reports from field commanders described an unending stream of American armor advancing inland. At first, Berlin dismissed these accounts as exaggerations. No nation, they argued, could possibly maintain such volume without collapsing its own economy. But what German officers soon uncovered, through captured documents, interrogations, and their own eyes, was something unprecedented, an entire logistical doctrine designed to feed an army faster than war could consume it. For the Americans, logistics was not an afterthought. It was the strategy itself. Long before the invasion, planners in London and Washington had drawn maps showing every road, depot, and bridge that would carry fuel and ammunition once the landings succeeded. Thousands of engineers built temporary ports known as mulberries and underwater pipelines, the Pluto system, to pump fuel directly from England to France. Behind the front, a small city of movement emerged, the Red Ball Express. Beginning in August 1944, nearly 6,000 trucks, driven mostly by African-American soldiers, ran day and night between the Normandy beaches and the advancing front lines. Each truck carried vital cargo, fuel, food, spare tank parts, and artillery shells. The convoy system operated on a closed loop, using color-coded routes and strict priority schedules. In just 3 months, the Red Ball Express delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. Every mile covered meant more tanks kept alive on the battlefield. Every drum of fuel meant another Sherman reaching its objective. German forces had no such luxury. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. Allied bombers targeted refineries and rail lines daily, crippling the Reich's transport capacity. Tiger and Panther tanks were often abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because there was no gasoline to move them. Field reports from the German 7th Army told the same story. Enemy armor appears in continuous waves. Our anti-tank guns destroy many, yet the flow does not diminish. It wasn't only numbers that shocked the Germans, it was the speed. Within days of securing a foothold in Normandy, the Americans had assembled tank repair shops, fuel depots, and field maintenance teams. A damaged Sherman might be towed back, repaired overnight, and rejoin combat the next morning. In contrast, the German army relied on scattered workshops, limited spare parts, and overburdened railways. Even when a tank could be fixed, getting it back to the front was a logistical nightmare. To German officers trained in the rigid efficiency of the Wehrmacht, this American flexibility seemed chaotic, yet it worked. What they perceived as disorder was actually a decentralized, self-sustaining system. Each division managed its own logistics, drawing from a vast pool of standardized equipment and supplies. By late summer, the truth was unavoidable. American power didn't lie solely in firepower or tactics. It lay in an industrial rhythm that no other nation could match. And as German officers watched their own lines shrink under the pressure, they began to realize they were not fighting just an army. They were fighting a continent that had learned to move. To understand why the Sherman never stopped coming, one must look beyond the battlefield, to the factories that gave it life. The M4 Sherman was not built for brilliance. It was built for volume. Every nut, bolt, and track link was designed with interchangeability in mind. Unlike the German Tiger, which required precision machining and scarce alloys, the Sherman could be produced in almost any large factory. Its components were standardized so completely that parts made in Chicago could fit seamlessly into tanks assembled in Detroit or Lima, Ohio. This philosophy of mass mobility extended to every corner of American production. In 1943, the Office of War Production oversaw nearly 16 million workers contributing to military manufacturing. Carpenters, welders, and even typewriter technicians found themselves retooled for war. Assembly lines ran around the clock, with women workers, the Rosies of wartime America, taking the places of men deployed overseas. The numbers tell the story better than propaganda ever could. By 1944, the U.S. was producing more than 40,000 tanks and tank destroyers per year. German industry, under relentless bombing and dwindling resources, could barely manage a tenth of that. But industrial power alone wasn't enough. The real genius lay in logistics planning, the invisible blueprint connecting factory to front line. Each Sherman came with a complete chain of support: spare engines, transmissions, road wheels, fuel lines, lubricants, and ammunition pre-packed in crates, sized for rapid loading. The same railroad cars that carried tanks to the docks could be reloaded with repair kits and sent back within days. Even the shipping containers were standardized, making unloading in European ports faster than any army before. The Sherman's modular nature meant a unit could strip a disabled tank for parts and have 3 others moving again before the enemy even realized the loss. To German engineers accustomed to complex craftsmanship, this seemed crude. But the Americans had traded finesse for reliability. They had discovered that in a total war, quantity, when supported by organization, became quality. When German officers finally inspected captured American supply depots, they saw endless rows of identical crates, marked, cataloged, and stacked like a city of steel. What they didn't see was chaos. They saw design, a system so vast. It made the idea of scarcity itself seem outdated. And yet, behind all this machinery, there was still the human element, the men who kept the rhythm alive on the road. Behind every tank that reached the front was a soldier who never saw combat, yet fought his own battle every day. These were the truck drivers, engineers, mechanics, and quartermasters who turned America's industrial might into living movement. The Red Ball Express became their lifeline. Beginning in August 1944, when the Allied armies pushed through France faster than planners expected, supply lines stretched thin. Railroads were still damaged, so the U.S. Army turned to its trucks. From Normandy to Chartres and onward toward the German border, convoys rolled day and night, headlights covered, engines roaring in long, unbroken lines. Most of these drivers were young African-American soldiers serving in segregated units. They worked under constant fatigue, rain, and risk of ambush. They slept beside their trucks, repaired engines with flashlights in mud, and navigated roads jammed with refugees and wreckage. Each hour mattered. Without them, the tanks would stop and the front would freeze. Field commanders quickly realized that logistics had become the real front line. American tank units could not advance without the flow of fuel, the lifeblood of modern war. General Patton's Third Army, consuming nearly 500,000 gallons per day, often depended on the Red Ball Express to keep moving. When German forces cut bridges or ambushed convoys, replacement routes appeared within hours. Engineers built makeshift crossings out of Bailey Bridge sections and fuel drums. Meanwhile, in the field, the Sherman crews learned to live as extensions of their machines. They carried spare track links strapped to the hull, cooked on engine heat, and performed field repairs with whatever parts they could salvage. The tanks became symbols of mobility, imperfect in armor, but unstoppable in motion. German troops who faced them noticed this rhythm. A village captured in the morning would see American armor replaced by new waves before nightfall. Even destroyed bridges or wrecked vehicles failed to halt the advance for long. The Americans improvised, adapted, and kept coming. To the Germans, this flexibility felt unnatural. Their own army operated on meticulous orders and centralized control. The Americans trusted initiative. A sergeant could reroute fuel trucks, a mechanic could improvise a part, and both decisions could save an entire unit. This was more than logistics. It was a mindset. It was the human engine that powered the industrial one, and it made the Sherman seem truly endless. By late July 1944, the Allies were still confined to a narrow strip of Normandy coastline. The hedgerows made movement slow and costly. German panzer divisions, dug into defensive positions, were holding the line until Operation Cobra began. The operation's success would hinge on one thing: movement. If the Americans could break through and sustain that momentum, the German front would collapse. If not, the invasion risked stagnation. On the morning of July 25th, the U.S. First Army unleashed over 3,000 aircraft in one of the most concentrated aerial bombardments of the war. When the dust settled, the German defenses around Saint-Lô were shattered. But the real test began once the tanks started rolling. Columns of Shermans advanced through the shattered bocage, cutting paths where roads no longer existed. Each mile forward demanded fuel, ammunition, and repair, and the supply chain had to stretch itself thin across a countryside still choked with debris. Yet somehow, it worked. Convoys from Normandy's beaches kept arriving without pause. American engineers laid new roads overnight, cleared wrecks, and guided supply trucks using simple wooden signs marked with red balls. Within 48 hours, the breach widened. German commanders watching from observation points couldn't believe the pace. Reports from the 2nd Panzer Division noted, enemy tanks appear in groups of 10, then 20. They advance as if losses are meaningless. It wasn't arrogance, it was logistics. For every Sherman knocked out, 2 more replaced it. For every fuel depot destroyed by artillery, another convoy was already en route. By the first days of August, the U.S. 4th Armored Division had pushed beyond Avranches, opening the road into Brittany. The breakout had succeeded, and what followed resembled a flood more than a military advance. American armor surged across France so rapidly that supply officers struggled just to keep up with the map. In those same days, captured German officers were brought to see what their men had reported. They inspected the captured American depots, rows of tanks lined for maintenance, mechanics working under floodlights, spare engines stacked in neat rows. One observer described it later as a city that moves. That phrase spread quietly among staff circles, a bitter acknowledgement of what they were facing. An enemy whose strength wasn't only in its weapons, but in its ability to replace them faster than anyone could destroy them. As August turned to September 1944, the truth could no longer be ignored inside the German command. The Allies were no longer advancing by units. They were advancing by systems. Every bridge repaired, every gallon of fuel delivered, every spare part fitted, became a weapon in itself. German officers began to write internal memoranda, trying to comprehend the American logistical model. One report by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht noted, "Their material flows without interruption. No delay between consumption and replacement. This is industrial warfare." At the front, that observation translated into despair. German anti-tank teams destroyed dozens of Shermans in single engagements. Yet their commanders noticed no gap in the enemy's movement. Where one column burned, another appeared on the horizon, headlights glinting through the smoke. Even seasoned officers like General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, privately admitted that Germany had lost the war of mobility. His Panzer doctrine had once revolutionized warfare. But now, facing the Americans, he saw his own ideas outdone on a continental scale. The enemy had built not just a fast army, but a self-feeding one. Captured logistics hubs revealed why. The Americans had turned warfare into assembly. Bulldozers pushed wrecked tanks aside for repair teams. Cranes lifted engines into place. Mobile workshops hummed 20 miles from the front. Even destroyed tanks were not abandoned. They were towed, fixed, and returned. Nothing was wasted. At Chartres, German intelligence officers inspected a captured maintenance yard and recorded what they saw. Endless spare parts, oil, tools, and replacement vehicles. The organization is unbelievable. Every man knows his role. For German troops retreating eastward, the experience was surreal. The Allies never seemed to stop. Fuel convoys followed armored spearheads within hours. Bridges that were blown up in retreat were replaced by Bailey bridges before dawn. American units carried mobile kitchens, showers, and medical tents, luxuries unimaginable to the Wehrmacht at that stage of the war. One officer, writing from the collapsing front near the Seine, summed it up with quiet resignation. "We do not fight soldiers anymore. We fight an industry." And that industry was now unstoppable. From the beaches of Normandy to the gates of Paris, the machine kept moving, an ocean of steel, fuel, and willpower. For the first time, the German command understood that no tactical brilliance could stop an army powered by production itself. By early September 1944, the German front in France had collapsed. The speed of the American advance stunned even Allied commanders. From Normandy to Paris, from Paris to the Belgian border, the front had shifted hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. What had begun as a carefully planned breakout turned into a rolling pursuit, a momentum fueled by organization rather than chaos. American tank divisions, fed continuously by the Red Ball Express, crossed rivers, liberated towns, and reached the outskirts of Germany itself. The once feared panzer divisions were no longer cohesive fighting forces. Many had become isolated groups of tanks stranded without fuel or spare parts, waiting for orders that could no longer be carried out. German officers captured in these weeks often spoke not of defeat in battle, but of exhaustion in supply. They had watched their Tiger tanks sit immobile while American Shermans advanced without pause. Some confessed that for every tank they managed to destroy, more arrived as if conjured from the sea. Meanwhile, U.S. logistics officers faced their own struggle, keeping the momentum alive. The supply lines had grown dangerously long, and fuel shortages began to appear. But even here, adaptability saved the offensive. Makeshift refueling depots appeared along highways. Abandoned German fuel stores were repurposed. Allied engineers converted captured airfields into distribution centers within days. When Paris was liberated on August 25th, it wasn't only a moral victory, it was a logistical one. Behind the parades and flags stood an invisible army of supply clerks, mechanics, and drivers who had kept millions of tons of material flowing. And as German prisoners were marched past endless rows of new tanks and trucks awaiting deployment, they began to grasp what their generals had already concluded, that America's greatest weapon was not any single tank or gun, but the relentless rhythm of replacement. The machine had learned to feed itself, and it was still gaining speed. In the months that followed, the German army tried to recover. Field commanders regrouped behind the Siegfried Line, hoping that winter and terrain would slow the Allies. But the lesson of Normandy lingered. Every captured officer's report spoke of the same phenomenon: the endless arrival of American armor, supplies, and reinforcements. Even as autumn rains turned roads into rivers of mud, the U.S. logistical machine adapted. Tracked vehicles hauled fuel to forward positions. Engineers laid steel planking across flooded roads. Portable depots were set up inside captured towns, where locomotives were repaired, bridges rebuilt, and supplies repackaged for the next advance. The contrast to the German situation was stark. Allied bombing had crippled the Reich's industrial arteries. Refineries lay in ruins. Railways were twisted wreckage. Replacement tanks existed only on paper. The German army, once known for its precision and speed, now depended on horse-drawn wagons to move ammunition. By the winter of 1944, even the Ardennes counteroffensive, Hitler's last gamble, revealed the depth of the imbalance. The attack began with promise, but stalled within days. German armored columns ran out of fuel before reaching their objectives. Abandoned Panthers and Tigers dotted the frozen roadsides. Allied air reconnaissance later photographed scenes of motionless tanks surrounded by empty jerry cans. American supply officers studied those same photographs with quiet satisfaction. They didn't see symbols of enemy failure. They saw confirmation that their doctrine worked. The key to victory wasn't to fight harder, but to sustain longer. After the war, captured German generals like Albert Speer and Guderian openly acknowledged this truth. Speer later wrote, "The Americans waged war like engineers. They applied the principle of assembly to every front." The Sherman tank had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of an industrial age that had learned to fight at scale. And in the ruins of Europe, even Germany's surviving officers admitted the inevitable. You cannot defeat an army that can build itself faster than it can be destroyed. When the war finally ended in 1945, Europe lay in ruins, cities flattened, armies broken, millions displaced. But out of that devastation came a new understanding of what modern warfare truly meant. The Second World War had begun as a contest of armies and ended as a contest of systems. The German officers, who had once prided themselves on precision, discipline, and tactical mastery, discovered that these virtues meant little without fuel, steel, and constant motion. They had built the best tanks, the sharpest guns, the most efficient doctrines, but not the infrastructure to sustain them. The Americans had taken the opposite path. They built weapons that could be repaired, transported, and replaced faster than the enemy could adapt. Their real triumph was invisible. The supply chains, the logistics officers, and the workers who made victory possible long before the first shot was fired. Every Sherman tank that rolled across Europe carried more than a crew. It carried the weight of a continent's factories, the effort of millions who never saw battle but won it all the same. That unity between industry and soldier redefined power in the 20th century. In the years that followed, military academies around the world would study the American supply model. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Wars are not won only by strategy, but by sustainability. For the German officers who once stood on that ridge in Normandy, watching an endless line of Shermans stretch beyond sight, the memory stayed sharp. They had witnessed something greater than a tank column. They had seen the turning of an era. The age of the individual weapon had ended. The age of industrial warfare had begun.